So you joined H&M at a time where the company had completed several proof of concept efforts, had demonstrated some value. I believe didn't have much of a team, relied primarily on external resources at this point. What were your first steps in taking on the challenge to scale this more broadly within the organization?
It's a very good question, and I think my first reaction when joining H&M is what have I given myself into? It's nest with some really talented consultants, but they were focused so much on value, and I came in with the perspective, of course, with value, but how do I scale these type of efforts?
Hmm.
I started thinking, how do we actually recruit the amount of people that we need to recruit to replace these consultants? How do we streamline the technology and architecture? So one of the first things we started doing was communicating a lot more around the topics we were working on to make the market aware of that we were doing these type of investments to be able to attract talent into some of the very challenging problems we were working on. So we started crafting a storyline that we wanted to introduce to the general market as well. You should never underestimate communication to create a bit of buzz in the Nordics, because that's primarily where we started out, but also then more globally as well. Then, of course, popping the hood of all the use cases, looking at the technical architecture, trying to understand what the external consultancy firm had actually built. So some of the first thing I did was going out and hiring technical people that could understand the engineering aspect. It's one thing to build a model, but it's another thing to push it to production and keep it there, which requires a lot of engineering effort. So my first hires were some really senior machine learning engineers, and we created something we call a reference architect, because we wanted to maintain autonomy of the actual data science teams that were building the algorithms and the products to be able to run as fast as possible, but to be able to get as much central support as possible. It didn't make sense for us to make 10 different technical choices when they were trying to solve the same problem. So we started streamlining some of these choices to be able to speed up deliveries, started to harmonize the technical choices, and then, of course, started taking the use case over and rolling them out at a faster pace.
So
Um,
were at that point, were there existing data scientists within different business units and you were supporting them centrally, or were you also staffing up across the business in the various business units or departments?
It's a very relevant question. I've seen different companies do it differently. The
Mhm.
H&M approach was to do it centrally from
Okay.
the start, basically to incubate the capability rather to spread it out. What we realized and what I realized from my experience as well is if you put a data science in a team as the only technical and algorithmic person, they're going to have a problem delivering, not because they are, are bad at delivering, but they're not in the right context.
Hmm.
So you tend to see a relatively high turnover of data scientists being set as an isolated island in a business unit.
Yep.
So we decided to initially start with a central incubation.
Okay. When you pull back the covers on these proof of concepts, you were looking for trying to understand them technically, but what did you also learn from a value perspective? Like often there's misalignment between the needs of a proof of concept, meaning to show something flashy or fancy, and the ultimate needs of the business and how you align in a sustainable long-term way. Did that kind of issue come up for you?
I think that some of the really good things that with the external firm that we worked with, they were really good at understanding the business requirements. So they
Okay.
worked very closely. And I think a strategy from H&M side, given that they had handed over the technical development to an external firm, was to actually have an integrated person from the business in each use case. So the alignment around value and the delivery of these things, I would say were very well aligned.
Hmm.
The problems were more on the technical side because showing something shiny doesn't always scale.
Hmm.
My learnings and experiences start with the simplest thing that's better than random, that gives some sort of initial uplift, but you can scale it better.
Hmm.
You don't go with the most complex technology or algorithm from start because you don't know how that will scale.
Hmm.
So it's better to create a stable and scalable infrastructure rather than focusing on the modeling from day one if you're serious about.
And so what were some of the things that you built into that infrastructure as you started to pull these projects together?
So some of the things that we did is we looked at the process, and what I realized is if you understand what you're building, then you can map the processes, and then you can actually automate most of the things vis-a-vis the MLOps type of set. So what we did was basically to map out the development process and look on where are some of the major pain points that we have today. What I started realizing is that we had a lot of stale clusters on the cloud that weren't used 70% of the time. So we started moving over to a more scalable infrastructure. So we moved most of our development away from Jupyter notebooks into data, given that then we could have on-demand compute, that we could have more version control over the infrastructure. So we standardized on how we actually did model development. With those things, we also started looking on the orchestration. So we standardized it a lot around the workflow orchestration, going more into Airflow, building new pipelines into that things, and also looking on how do we productionalize and how do we follow up on these things. So for each of these process steps, we took a few design decisions and created supporting infrastructure for that.
Hmm. And then did you go to the actual, maybe taking a step back, were you building the infrastructure and promoting these proof of concepts into a more production capability at the same time, or did one come before the other? Did you pause on the POCs, build infrastructure, and then return to the POCs to make them scale? How did you approach?
Yeah, my general comment is super hard. It's on the concept of technical debt. So these POCs, some of them were in production already delivering value. And if you have a
Okay.
POC in production delivering value, it's hard to pull back because the business is going to go crazy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but what we started doing was we slowly worked with the different products, identifying their major pain points and gave them boilerplate code to start migrating towards. So some of the engineers, they went in, they did a small proof of concept, for instance, moving into Airflow and Kubernetes in some of the use cases and showed on the benefits. And then we had them pay down the technical debt. In our OKR, I even formulated goals for the product area to actually handle technical debt in their use cases, or product in this case. So we mandated them that not all your effort should go into new feature development and new rollout to new markets. It should be paying down the debt that we still owe on the proof of concepts.